Well, this certainly took a while, didn't it? Truth be told, the Crash Bandicoot series of reviews were supposed to be made back in September 2020 to hype up the launch for Crash Bandicoot 4. It's about time. Sadly though, a combination of me receiving certain bad commissions along with losing my job at the time shelved those plans for the moment. So, better late than never, I suppose, that I finally get to the Crash Bandicoot series of reviews. But I digress. We're here to talk about the Orange Marsupial and his first game alongside the remake in the Insane Trilogy. While I will say that Crash 1 is better played on the Insane Trilogy, I will not say that my opinion on that really extends to Crash Bandicoot 2 or 3, only to 1. We'll get into my reasoning for that when we do the Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back and Crash Bandicoot Warped reviews. For now though, my history with Crash Bandicoot 1 is almost non-existent as a child. I knew of the Crash series thanks to my cousin who introduced me to the franchise with Crash Team Racing, and I played Crash Bandicoot 2 at my aunt and uncle's house on his PlayStation. But Crash Bandicoot 1 was a game I personally did not play, let alone beat, until I bought the PS3's PSN Store copy around 2012, right before doing my first Let's Play of the game on this channel. I will admit, I have 100% in Crash Bandicoot 1 more times than I really should have, this review making it the 4th time for the PlayStation 1 version alone, and 5 times total if you count the Insane Trilogy version of the game. But for some background info on Crash Bandicoot, the game was created and developed by Naughty Dog and published by Universal Interactive Studios in 1996 for the original PlayStation as part of a deal between Naughty Dog, Universal Interactive, and Sony themselves. The game, launched 1 month before Super Mario 64, proved insanely popular due to its design, and Crash Bandicoot Mania swept around the gaming world, and especially in Japanese markets, which is a rarity for a lot of Western games at the time. The game environments were highly detailed for the time, and while not as free in movement as Super Mario 64 was, still proved to be a winning formula for Naughty Dog as Crash proved to be successful with each iteration and would eventually lead to Naughty Dog being acquired by Sony at the beginning of the PlayStation 2's life for them to make the Jak and Daxter series. Crash Bandicoot's popularity would eventually wane, but the original game set up the basis for a lot of groundwork that the sequels and what eventually Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time would utilize for its core gameplay. So why don't we go out of order a little bit and talk about the gameplay of Crash Bandicoot 1 and see how it handles and how well it holds up, if much at all, after all of this time, seeing as how many of the later games would end up using this sort of gameplay style for their own core gameplay mechanics. Crash Bandicoot 1's gameplay can be best summarized with these simple words: run, jump, break boxes, repeat. Being a platformer, and a precision platformer at that, Crash benefited from the side-scrolling and backwards view camera that allowed the player to arc their jumps to clear obstacles, enemies, and general platforming challenges. I will admit that Crash himself has a rather heavy-feeling jump in the original Crash Bandicoot game, much more so than Crash Bandicoot 2 and 3, which felt a lot more floaty and a lot more easy to control. By about the 3rd or 4th level, the player will make adjustments and become used to the physics of Crash Bandicoot 1 without a doubt. Breaking boxes is the name of the game, and collecting gems is incredibly important if the player wishes to get the optional 100% ending of Crash Bandicoot 1. In all seriousness, while Crash 1 can be easily adjusted to, it is definitely the hardest of the original Naughty Dog trilogy by far. Boxes are easy to break, sure, and the lack of nitro crates helps since Crash is very fragile and dies in one hit without an Aku Aku mask to protect him. But there are some asterisks next to all those points. First, the boxes are sometimes hidden behind colored gem paths from later levels, requiring backtracking to gather all the gems in the first place. Second, TNT crates have a nasty habit of not breaking even after they make the explosion sound effect if they are not visibly seen exploding on screen. Third, and most important, you can break every single box in a stage, but if you die even once, you are unable to obtain that gem of that level, as the game requires the player to not die even once in a stage in order to obtain the gem. This was fixed in the Insane Trilogy's version of Crash 1, but only for regular gems, as color gems still require the levels having no depths in them in order to acquire that gem. And let's just say the colored gem levels are very difficult, even in the original Crash Bandicoot 1. Levels all have different variations and themes, with usually 2 levels having the same theme within the game. Some are great and showed the power of the PS1 with its vibrant and lush jungles, while others showed bleak and depressing machinery or dark hallways. Out of all the levels, I personally love all the jungle levels and the indoor ruin levels, but I despise the dark hallway levels and the bridge levels. While the bridge levels were difficult, that was only because they were just precision platforming with the right timing being necessary. They were at least manageable is what I'm trying to say. While on the other hand, the hallway levels are extremely frustrating, especially if you get hit or break an Aku Aku crate too early, because then you'll be forced in the dark with just leap of faith gameplay half the time, ultimately resulting in a death. Then there was what was added into the Insane Trilogy's version of Crash Bandicoot 1, which was a previously cut level known as Stormy Ascent, and time trial relics to bump up the Crash Bandicoot 1 overall percentage to 104% rather than 100% as was in the original. Stormy Ascent is a brutally long level and difficult to play through, which can be rather annoying, especially with the fact that inside of the Insane Trilogy, the ton of bonus rooms, which were originally the only way you could save in the original Crash, as well as the Embryo and Cortex bonus rooms, boxes are required to get in order to get a box gem inside of a level. Not only that, but even worse are the time trials, as they add a new frustration to the Crash Bandicoot 1 formula, as not only can you not die when doing time trials, but Crash Bandicoot 1's levels were not necessarily designed with speed in mind, unlike later Crash Bandicoot levels in the later games. Thus, the time trials with their Sapphire, Gold, and Platinum relics are really only necessary if you're going for true completion, and otherwise I would recommend highly ignoring them entirely. I'll go more into details in time trials in the next review for the Crash series, as I do find that it's better to do it in that game, although it can be just as frustrating, if not slightly more than Crash Bandicoot 1's time trials, because of a power-up that was added into the Crash Bandicoot 2 Insane Trilogy formula. Just know that in the original Crash Bandicoot 1, there were no time trials, so it was just get point A to point B, get gems, lather, rinse, repeat. But while the gameplay of Crash Bandicoot 1 may have some kinks overall, it still works, and that is the important part. But how does the story hold up? Let's jump into the machinations of a mad scientist and see what would end up coming to be his worst mistake he ever made, with the Crash Bandicoot 1 story. Crash Bandicoot 1's story is accessed through not the manual like most other games at the time were, but rather by simply waiting on the title screen for a small cutscene to play. Crash Bandicoot begins with Dr. Neo Cortex and his assistant, Dr. Nitrous Brio, experimenting on Crash to turn him into the perfect general for Cortex's commandos in order for him to take over the world. When the experiment fails and Crash escapes, Cortex states to prepare the next test subject as the camera cuts to Tawna Bandicoot, Crash's girlfriend, quote-unquote, of sorts. She doesn't have much of a personality really in Crash Bandicoot 1 and wouldn't return well until recently, when she was given more personality in Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled, as well as the recent release of Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time. More on Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time briefly as well. The recent release of that game has retconned certain aspects of Crash Bandicoot 1, but I'll get more into that when I eventually do the review of It's About Time. For now, just know that Crash's main goal is to save Tawna from Cortex and inadvertently put a stop to Cortex's commandos, who will all get in Crash's way as he makes his way back to Castle Cortex. Summarizing, basically, Crash Bandicoot's story is more or less, go stop the megalomaniac from being a bad man. The Insane Trilogy's version of Crash 1 remain largely unchanged story-wise, with only minor tweaks here and there for consistency's sake, and just to add certain details here and there to make things seem a little bit more modern, I guess would be the perfect word to use for it. Combine the story with a memorable soundtrack, and you've got the basic story that can be remembered by many children in the 90s for over 2 decades, as can be seen with how the Insane trilogy was largely successful. Going into Crash Bandicoot's soundtrack real quick, Crash Bandicoot's soundtrack is all thanks to the part of the talented composer Josh Mansell. Mansell would later go on to conduct the soundtracks for the subsequent series Jak and Daxter for Naughty Dog, but a lot of his strides when composing for the PlayStation 1 Crash Bandicoot series and up to Crash Team Racing can be seen in his later soundtracks, to be sure. My favorite themes have to go to Ripperoo's theme, Dr. Neo Cortex's theme, and of course the ever-classic Insanity Beach theme. Mansell's themes and influence on the series based on his compositions are still felt even to this day, as many of the tracks that were originally used in the classic Crash series were nodded to in modern compositions, which I really like. Much like how David Borgard helped define Ratchet & Clank's identity early on, Josh Mansell would do the same thing for Crash Bandicoot as a whole, and that cannot be understated. Voice acting, on the other hand, for Crash Bandicoot 1 was highly limited. The only characters who had real lines of dialogue in the game were Dr. Neo Cortex and Dr. Embryo. Technically the same person, which was Brendan O'Brien, as Brendan O'Brien would voice Crash Bandicoot, Pinstripe Potoroo, all the little sound effects that would be done by the characters, as well as Dr. Neo Cortex and Dr. Embryo, as mentioned beforehand. Now, on the other hand, the Insane trilogy remake of Crash Bandicoot 1 would use the later voice actors that were used in the Mutant series, such as Jess Harnell for Crash, Lex Lang for Dr. Neo Cortex, Maurice LaMarche for Dr. Nitrous Brio, and Debbie Derryberry for Tawna. The added details and performances from these actors make the Insane Trilogy's version of Crash Bandicoot 1 more enjoyable, and the remastered scores of Josh Mansell's work come together to give a great performance overall for the Insane Trilogy, still making it, I believe, the better version of the game to play than the original Crash Bandicoot 1. Overall, the first Crash Bandicoot is rather rough around the edges, and while the Insane Trilogy's remake of Crash 1 doesn't giving it many different quality of life updates, I will say that many of its original problems that Crash Bandicoot 1 are still there, even in the Insane Trilogy. The heavy jumps, difficult platforming, and sometimes frustrating requirements always make Crash Bandicoot 1 a game that I go back to the least when compared to Crash 2 and 3. Luckily, the Insane Trilogy is available on all major platforms for PC, Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo, so people have many options to try the game at least. If for some reason you wish to try the original Crash Bandicoot, then sadly the only options available are limited to the PS1 version and the PlayStation Store version, which the PSN version can only be played on the PS3 or PSP. A Vita version does exist, but only for European PSN stores for the PS Vita, which has always been rather odd for a lot of people. But overall, would I still recommend Crash Bandicoot 1? Honestly, unless you're already a fan of the series, then no, not really. The story is easy to just see a synopsis for, and the sequels are much better places to start with, especially with the next game we're going to be looking at, Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back. Even with the Insane Trilogy and the original, and the Insane Trilogy improving so much over the original, Crash Bandicoot 1 is still a very frustrating game that could put you off of the Crash Bandicoot series, which is why I would recommend to start with Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back, or even Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped. Sure, you wouldn't understand the story as much, but it's not that hard to understand the stories, which is something that Crash really benefits from. But anyway, guys, I'm gonna end it off right here. This has been Neronium, and I thank you all for watching my review of Crash Bandicoot and the Insane Trilogy's version of Crash Bandicoot. See you all next time for when we tackle Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back. So, see you all next time.